What's up everybody? It's Dan here at Launch Academy and here to bring you another episode of the HTML show. I'm really excited about today's episode because we've really just up until this point just covered the fundamentals of HTML and CSS. And now we're going to start to get into some of the development methodologies and organizational type components of the course, which I'm super excited to walk through with you. So today we're going to actually start working with multiple files. Throughout the duration of the course thus far, we've been really dealing with a single HTML document. And today what I want to do is walk you through how we can link to external style sheets and why we should do that, why that's important. And I also want to start working with locally stored files such as images, as well as multiple HTML documents. So for the first time, we'll be working in the context of an HTML directory or a web page directory rather than an individual file. And this is really the way most developers typically work. And we'll show you some strategies and some ideas for organization as we go along. And along the way as well, we'll talk about things like background images and how to repeat those images using CSS. So we'll continue to start to build this tool set. We're learning all new CSS rules as we move along here. So while we talk about the practice, we'll also talk and continue to dive into those fundamentals simultaneously. All right, awesome. And hey, just one more friendly reminder. I just want to show everyone the Slack chat that we've got going on here in the main window. And I hope you'll join us at launch-html-course.slack.com. If you don't yet have your invitation, you can go ahead and get that at the, what's the URL there, Spencer? HTML show. I thought I had it bookmarked here. But you can get your invite. We'll send the URL shortly. Spencer's going to hook me up with that. It's the html-show-slack.launchacademy.com. Go ahead and redeem your invite there. And we just use Slack all the time here at Launch Academy. We've got people showing their work, and I'm critiquing their code as they work through it. And we're just talking about general web trends and things like that. So we call learning to code a social sport. So get in on the conversation and join us here. And if you're not able to join us live, still join us in the chat room, still show your work. Remember, we're trying not to be spectators here. We're trying to learn by doing. And you learn better by doing when you do it socially. So join me in the online chat room. We've got lots of great conversation happening there. All right. Awesome. So let's move this back over here. All right. And let's dive into today's material. So to date, we've been putting all of our CSS rules here in the style element of our head. And while this is better than using inline attributes, the style attribute, if you remember, that's how we started writing CSS, it's still prone to some problems. For example, every time I load this page, I have to load all of this CSS information. And all this CSS information basically takes away from the content that shows below it. So it's super redundant for me as a developer to have to constantly scroll up and down between my HTML markup and my CSS code. So wouldn't it be great if we could move this markup, this CSS here, and actually move it to an external style sheet? Well, thankfully we can do that using an HTML link tag. And why is this a good idea? Well, firstly, it's going to allow us to practice something that we all like as developers, which is this idea of separation of concerns. So we can use a separate CSS document to basically just be singly responsible for the idea of presentation and aesthetics in the context of our larger web project. Secondly, for our end users, we can take advantage of things like browser caching. So that CSS document is only downloaded once. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. But really for me, the main benefit is developmental clarity. I like having all my things nicely organized. And you'll hear this a lot, that the best developers are lazy. And that's because they're constantly trying to make their jobs easier for themselves. So there's a place for everything, and everything should be in its place so that you don't have to think when you dive into a project that you haven't been to in a few days. And really it just should be just coherent and clear what files are responsible for what. So let's practice this technique of separating concerns and move our styles to an external style sheet. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy all of this text inside the style element. And we're going to cut it out of the page. And we're going to create a new folder in the context of our working directory. And I'm going to call this CSS because all my CSS files are going to go in there. And you can call it whatever you'd like. It could be styles, CSS. Some people go as short to just say C. It doesn't matter, but one thing that I think is particularly important is that you have a file, a folder, a subdirectory, whatever you might want to call it, that houses exclusively all of your CSS documents in the context of your larger web project. So notice here too that I'm using the project drawer for really the first time as part of our editing here. And I'm going to just call this main.css. And I'm going to take all of the content that I cut out of my HTML document, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in this CSS document. And notice that Adam has done us a nice favor and continues to use the syntax highlighting that we saw in the HTML document so that we can write really clean and effective CSS code. Now watch what happens if I just go and save this now. I've moved all the CSS, but I haven't yet instructed my HTML document where to get those styles. So I have to go ahead and use a link tag in order to make that connection happen. So we're going to use a link source CSS main.css, and I'm going to give it a rel attribute of style sheet, typo, and I'm going to title it default. So your link tags should always appear in your head element, and you want to use what's called a relative path for right now to basically attach your CSS information to your HTML markup. So we use a slash to separate the folder name and the file name. So we're basically saying from where our HTML document is, go into the CSS directory and find the main.css file. And that's what's happening here. So watch what happens when I save this and refresh the page. I'm sorry, it's an href, not a source attribute here. We want to use an href attribute. And here we go. All our CSS that we designed and developed over the last few episodes is now retained. And how much cleaner and nicer is it to just have this one line rather than all of those CSS rules in that HTML document? It's just cleaner. We're separating concerns. We're dealing with CSS exclusively in this file, and we can reference that CSS in multiple HTML documents to basically prevent duplication and to have a single point of reference for all of our style information. So we use that link tag quite a bit in the context of web development. Super, super handy. But let's take a look at the mechanics of what's actually happening in the browser when I go ahead and I refresh this page. And to do that, you guessed it, we're going to use the Chrome Inspector to do exactly that. So we've talked about the Elements tab here in the Chrome Inspector, but we also have some other neat tabs that you should check out. And today I want to focus primarily on the Sources, the Network, and the Timeline tabs, because they're going to tell you a lot about how a web browser actually functions in retrieving all of these resources that we're making use of in the context of our HTML page. So the first one I want to show you is, notice that we've got this Sources tab, and the Sources tab basically is going to show us all the files that are at play in the context of our HTML document. So notice we've got the HTML itself, and now because we've got this link tag, it's also going to associate this main.css, where we can find all of our CSS rules in that single file. So we can use the Sources tab as essentially a way to understand what resources or assets the HTML document is using. Now notice too that there's also mention of CloudFront here, and it's pulling up an actual image, which is the image of our dog. So the way the browser works is it's going to go ahead and retrieve the HTML markup. And then the HTML markup is going to have references to images, CSS, and JavaScript files that it then needs to go and download and make use of in the web as well. So we can use this Sources tab to develop an understanding of the additional assets that an HTML document is going to require for you to display this a nice aesthetic web page. So we see here that it's downloading the CSS document, and it's downloading the HTML image as well. Awesome, okay. So the sources can give us kind of a clue of the what, but let's look at the network and timeline tabs to understand the how. All right, so we're gonna actually check all of these and watch what happens when I refresh the page. When I refresh the page, the network view is going to give us all kinds of information about the files that we are incorporating as part of the large HTML document. And you can see this sort of timeline view. And what's interesting about this is our web browser is going to download multiple documents at once. So rather than just downloading that hello.html document, we're seeing for the first time that it actually downloads multiple documents based on the contents of our HTML markup. So it loads the main.css page after the hello page is downloaded, and then it also downloads the image. Now, because we're working on the local file system for both the HTML document and the CSS document, the time it takes to download is going to be very minimal. But notice here how we see some time to download and some time to connect to download our HTML image here. And that's because we're going out to cloudfront.net and we're downloading and rendering that image. So you're seeing that time take place here in the timeline as well. And that's going to take a little bit more time because we're actually using an external resource. So we have to go out to the web, make that connection to that external resource, and we actually have to download the image. And that's the stuff that you're seeing here in the timeline in the third row here. And we can also see this network timeline when we refresh the page and we look at our network timeline. So we see all the things that our HTML web page is downloading, and we can get perspective. It's a little hard to see here because my text is blown up, but you can get perspective on all the performance characteristics of this web page and how long it's taking to essentially load the rendering, how much it takes to actually paint the visual display on the page, and downloading and idle time and things like that. So the sources, network, and timeline tabs are often used as web developers to really understand how your web page is performing. And this will get increasingly more important as we start to put our web pages online. We have network traffic and things like download size to consider. And really our objective as a web developer is to deliver an awesome experience in the shortest amount of time possible. So that means doing things like trying to decrease the amount of white space and space in our CSS files and trying to make those as concise as possible, and trying to make our images so that they look like they're high quality, but they aren't as dense in size and file size, so that it doesn't take our users, our end users, a huge amount of time to download them. So we have this balancing act to handle in terms of aesthetics and speed. And thankfully now with mobile broadband and our awesome cable and broadband connections on the desktop, we really don't have this large consideration or as large of a consideration as we once did. You can imagine how much more important this was when we had things like dial-up internet, where every download really incurred a significant cost to the overall browsing experience. But thankfully now with 4G on the mobile and with broadband connections at home, this becomes less of an issue, but it's still important. As you can imagine with mobile broadband, not everyone gets a 4G connection, particularly those in undeveloped or developing nations. So you want to keep that in mind as you're building your web properties. Awesome, okay, so we talked about all the benefits of linking to external style sheets. let's talk a little bit more about images and how we can improve the performance of our image that we have here rendered in our HTML web page. So up until this point, we've been using, if you remember, a fully qualified URL to represent our particular image. And this is bad for a number of reasons. Mainly, if CloudFront goes down and for whatever reason their service goes down and I'm unable to retrieve this image, or even worse, they change this image to represent something completely different, I'm really at a place where I have no control over what is happening with this URL. And as a web developer, we really want to centralize that control, and we also want to eliminate areas, possible areas of failure and downtime. So to do so, what we should do is we should actually replace this image with an image that we host, that we control. And what I've done ahead of this call is I have actually gone ahead and retrieved an original photo of my two pups. It's a little blurry, but over here on the left, that's Linux, and over here on the right, that's Apple when she was just a little puppy. So let's go ahead and swap them in, an original image here, for the image that we used by using the Google Images search. So to do that, I'm going to right click on the image, I'm going to copy the image address, and I'm just going to replace the source here. And let's see what this looks like. And I use Google Photos for my images, so we can go ahead and throw that in there. And man, that's huge. So we're going to have to actually use CSS to modify that image. Now, before we were going up to our head and making that change there. Now we're actually navigating to a completely different file. And you can use Atom's tab interface to move back and forth. One of my favorite hotkeys are the command and then digit keys. So command 1 will get me to the Learning Objectives tab. Command 2 will get me to the main.css tab. And command 3 will get me to the hello.html tab. And interestingly too, Atom has this wonderful feature. If I hit Command T and start to type in a file name and then hit enter, it's going to navigate me to the file itself as well. And as a developer, we call this the fuzzy file finder. And it's super important as we start to work with more and more files and our file system becomes more and more complicated. We want to get used to using this fuzzy file finder. It's just a really handy development tool that's become very popular only recently, I'd say, in the last 10 years or so, thanks to the TextMate text editor. We've got this huge amount of functionality at our fingertips so that we can move from file to file rather quickly. So here, we want to essentially make my image a little bit smaller. So what we're going to do is we're going to create, well, we'll just call it a puppy image. And we're going to use an ID-based selector. And if you don't know what an ID-based selector is, you need to go back to some of the earlier material. I think it might have been episode 5 or 6 that we started using CSS selectors. And we're going to use an ID-based selector here to basically specify that I really only want this to be 400 pixels in width. All right, so save that. And wow, that's a lot more manageable. And actually a lot more clearer. It doesn't look as blurry. Cool. Now, one thing to note about this image is the browser is still downloading that hugely high-res version. It's blurry, but it's actually high-res. You might not be able to see it on the recording. So the weight of this image is actually heavier than what it has to be to display the quality of image that we have here. If I was thinking like a front-end dev, I might actually go ahead and manually resize the image using a tool like GIMP or Adobe Photoshop so that my users aren't downloading an unnecessarily large image to represent this concept of my two dogs. So image optimization is a whole nother area of front-end engineering and front-end development. But suffice to say, we would open it up in a photo editor and we'd resize it, which would thereby decrease the download time of that particular image. We're just going to constrain the width for now and show how that works. And I'm going to just demonstrate what would happen if I made an error in my, or if the URL went down. We saw this in earlier episodes, but I want to reinforce this. So let's imagine that the Google Photos was down, now I see this broken image. And this is a poor experience for the end user, right? So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we control and centralize the hosting of this image. So like we can host our CSS files locally in our file system, we're going to do the same for our images. And because this is my image, and I took it, I own property to it, I own the property, I can save this image to my directory. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new directory, like I said, a place for everything and everything in its place. I'm going to create an images directory, and I'm going to name my file so that it has context. And notice that that downloaded completed and my editor was updated to include this image. So now it shows up in my editor here. And rather than using a fully qualified path for the source attribute, I'm going to use a relative path and point to that image using the directory and file name that I used when I downloaded it off the web. So now let's see if that changes things. Cool. And if we look in the timeline or the network tab here, see how much quicker that is because I'm working on the local file system? I didn't have to go to an external host, download that, connect and download that image. So my image actually renders a lot quicker. So we call that a centralizing control or eliminating possibilities of failure. In the web development world, it's really, really easy to become dependent on external resources. And every time you rely on an external resource, you introduce a path of failure in your code. So as much as you can centralize the management of your CSS and your HTML images and later your external JavaScripts, the more control you're going to have and the less likely you are to have users adversely affected. Cool. Okay. So we talked about how to set images and how to save images as part of a multi-file sort of paradigm and world. But one thing that we didn't talk about was how you can actually set background images in the context of your HTML web pages. And you guessed it, we do that through the tool that is designed and used to generate aesthetic value, and that would be a concern of the CSS. So let's say, for example, that we wanted to set the body's background image to something that's a little more textured. Something like this, for example. It's just a tiled sort of little bluer version of what we have here on our HTML web page. So what we can do is we can set the background like so. And here we're using a fully qualified URL here. And let's see what that does. See how that took a little bit of time to load? And that's because, you guessed it, if we look at our network tab, we're going out to the web and downloading that file. So again, this introduced a path of failure, a path where we're now dependent on the Wikimedia host to basically provide us with that image. So because it's allowed for us to use this without attribution per the statements in the Google image search that I did, I can actually go ahead and save this image to the same place that I put Linux and Apple in there. And we're going to just say BG texture. And rather than using a fully qualified path, I'm going to use a relative path. And in this case, I have to go down one directory using the ... to basically navigate out of the CSS folder and into my 008 directory here, and go back into the images directory and reference this BG texture file. So what I've done here is I've used the ... to basically navigate up the file system to the 008 file, and then I go into the images directory and reference the BG texture file. So this is using a relative path in the context of my CSS document. So notice how that loaded a little bit faster. Great. And this actually covers the width, the full width of the HTML web page, and I get this nice little texture to my document. Now, I can customize this background so that it does not repeat. And I can change this also so that it repeats horizontally using repeat X. And I can do so the same way vertically via repeat Y. And we're dealing with a particularly large background image, so let's actually change the background width to 400 pixels so you can get an idea of what this would do. Background size. So let's go to the MDN. Just kind of seeing in live improv here how I can use the background docs on MDN to basically become more informed about the CSS rule. And I'm looking for a background size, yeah. Background size, 400 pixel, and then we'll set auto for the height. See how I've set the background repeat vertically, but I've manually set the width of my background to 400 pixels. So the background is not going to repeat automatically. It's going to stop at 400 pixels. And then my background repeat Y is going to allow that background texture to expand and repeat vertically. Now watch what happens if I set repeat X and I constrain the height to 500 pixels. Now it's repeating across the screen horizontally. Every 500 pixels we get a new instance of the background image. And you can do all kinds of crazy things with background images, things like offset them using the box model that we learned about in the previous episode. Go ahead and check all of that out and what you can do to manipulate backgrounds in the context of the Mozilla Development Network. There's tons of stuff that you can do. You can even, in later browsers, in the latest versions of browsers, you can set things like gradients and stuff like that. There's just a whole world of background related material to dive into. But for now, just know that you can reference a background image, you can set the size, and you can set whether it repeats both horizontally and vertically or separately. You can also constrain it to not repeat at all, as we saw in the first sort of iteration. Awesome. Okay. So now we've talked about how we can link to external CSS documents, and we've talked about how we can link to external images. But one thing that we haven't yet worked on is how we can actually have multiple HTML files in the context of our larger web project. And one of the wonderful things about the World Wide Web is we can use this concept of hyperlinking to basically subdivide our pages and make use of that sort of process so that we can keep our web pages short and sweet and to the point and topical to what we want to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file here, and I'm going to call it Technical Interests. And I'm going to go ahead and just plug in here some of my technical interests. One of my favorite things is this technique called test-driven development, and things like agile methodologies. Lately, the whole team's been really into React.js, which is a JavaScript framework. Really, really cool. And I've actually been playing around quite a bit with Erlang and Elixir in Phoenix. All right, so notice that what I have here is an HTML fragment. And if you've been playing along well at home, you realize that this is not a valid HTML document. If I want a valid HTML document, what things do I need? And if you're not sure or not immediately ready to answer that question, if you're quizzing yourself and that's something that's not immediately clear, go back to some of the earliest episodes, episodes 1 and 2, to really make sure that you understand these concepts. So the first thing that we're going to need is the doc type. We can actually go ahead and copy and paste that from our hello.html. And we're also going to need the HTML tag with a head and a body. Okay, so now we've got a valid HTML document. Which is great. Okay, so let's go ahead and link to this document in our hello.html. And I'm going to go ahead and put this at the top in my nav. And I'm going to say use a relative path for the first time in the context of our HTML document. And this is in the same directory, so I don't need to specify anything with a slash or anything like that. I'm just pointing to the relative path of the document itself. Close my anchor tag, close my list item tag, and I go ahead and I refresh the page. And let's make this less ugly. Go back to our CSS and get rid of our sizes. Yeah, I'll just comment those out actually, so you have them as reference. All right, awesome. So now if I link to my tech interest, notice that I've got a very bland HTML document. And that's because we have attached our CSS to our hello.html file, but without this link tag, without kind of connecting our technical interest document to the same CSS, we're going to get that vanilla user agent styling, and it's going to provide an inconsistent experience from page to page. So I'm going to actually copy and paste this link so that we can have the benefit of the CSS that we externalized at the beginning of this episode. And now I get something that resembles or comes close to resembling the HTML styling that we provided previously. Now, notice as well that I don't have what we call the browser Chrome or any of the consistent navigation elements. And in the context of static website development, we actually have to duplicate all of that content. So I have to go in here and copy my entire nav to get that perspective in my technical interest document. So we can see how this gets more and more complicated as we start to intermingle our site copy and we have multiple HTML documents. And this is where dynamic web development can really help us so that we're not duplicating all this content. But for the purposes of this course, we're primarily focused on building static websites. So we may have some markup duplication from page to page. Awesome. All right, so homework for you. Go ahead and refactor your web page. I want you to take your single page and I want you to extract all of the CSS to a separate resource and make use of the link element. I also would like for you to start making use of some more images in the context of your website. Incorporate both an image using the image tag, and also for a specific section or for the entire page, make use of a background image as well. And then lastly, I want you to create a separate page that's as consistent from a look and feel perspective as your actual hello document that outlines some of your technical interests. And make sure to make use of that external style sheet so that you provide some consistency from page to page. Awesome. Well, we covered a lot in today's episode. If you have any questions, I hope you'll get engaged with us on the Slack chat channel. And until then, and until next time, I will see you. Keep coding, keep working at it, and I will see you on Thursday. See you next time. Bye-bye.